I'll get underway with a discussion of the latest from the Russia-NATO war. Now, you may be aware that there's the stories floating around at the moment are all about, well, what's happening with the great Ukrainian offensive. This was, of course, as we have said on this program on numerous occasions, the much promised offensive that has been talked about really since October of last year. I looked back over postings on Telegram and in media stories, and they were talking about a great assault into the Zaporozhye region and driving down onto the coast through Melitopol and ultimately going towards Mariupol as this great sweep of the NATO forces that are mainly staffed by Ukrainians and Poles and various other mercenaries. Their great sweep to cut off Crimea and inflict a massive psychological and very real defeat on the Russians and ending the war. And this has been talked about for almost a year now. It was talked about for over 8 months before this thing was launched. And so when it was launched at the beginning of June, then obviously this had been built up more than a Star Wars sequel, and with equally disappointing results and an even bigger budget. So what has happened is that this has all come down to a now extremely online argument between pro-Russia and pro-NATO people on Twitter as to whether one village named Rabotina has been taken or not. The Ukrainians this morning claiming that they had taken it, the Russians then issuing a series of denials and putting out some footage showing that they hadn't and the Russians were still there. Now I'm going to call up a map here just to show you what we're talking about. And this is the map, this is Live UA map I've taken this image from. The first image you are going to see is a zoomed out map from Live UA map of the entire front line. So you can see I'll just call it up here. If you're listening to this on the audio on Patreon, this will be one of the images that is attached to the file, to the sound file. So this map here from Live UA map, which is the pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO source. And you can see from the red line, that's basically the red line shows where there's incidents of fighting or exchanges of fire. And so you can see there, it's all along, apart from a slight gap there, just directly above Crimea, all along the line of contact, all the way up there into the north, you can see that there's been significant exchanges of fire over the last 24 hours. And that's the zoomed out picture. You can see some other incidents, for instance, in Crimea recently, you can see that the maker of the map has marked something down on there. That's all to do with the fact that the Ukrainians tried an amphibious landing there, and in a bizarre incident was seen off by a man in his Speedos, which is pretty damn bizarre, to be completely honest with you. So that's the zoomed out picture that you can see there. Now, there's a more, should we say, zoomed in picture, which I will move to now. So this is taken from Google Maps, this one, and it's just a picture as to the zoomed out area as to where all this is going on. So for instance, you can see Mariupol there on the right hand side, and you can see the other towns under discussion, and up the towards the left there, that is of course where a lot of this action is actually taking place, up towards Melitopol, because it's Melitopol that is one of their targets. And so to have any chance of presenting what they have done as a success, they have to at least get near it. And so far, no luck. So what they've actually got so far is that they've got nowhere near Melitopol. There is a town immediately up from Melitopol on if you follow a road that bends around in a northeasterly direction. There's another town called Tokmak, which has an air base within it, and another airbase marked on the map quite nearby. And that was talked about as a target of the Ukrainian offensive when this began back in June. So the idea that they were going to get to at least Tokmak was something that was discussed by even pro-Russian commentators. For instance, that's what was Mark Sloboda's prediction, I think, as to where they might get to. Now, they haven't even got to there as yet. So they haven't got to Tokmak. Where they've got to, and where the sides are now arguing about who's got what, is this place, Rabatina. And that's, if you follow the map, up the road from Tokmak, immediately again bending to a northeasterly direction, there is this village called Rabatina, which had less than 500 residents prior to the beginning of the special military operation. Now it seems to be divided roughly 70-30 in Ukraine's favor. But that is the result. That is the result of the offensive that has taken place so far. And I'll now switch to a more close-in map so you can see what I'm talking about when I'm referring to Rabotina. So you can see there that this is the more zoomed in map. You can see Tokmak there at the bottom, on the bottom left, and you follow the road that comes out and bends in a sort of sharp northeasterly direction. It goes up to Rabotina. So this is the sum total of the progress that the Ukrainian forces, under, lest we forget, the direction of NATO, has made over 2 months, and at the cost of, depending upon the estimates that you want to believe, I'll switch back now to the zoomed out map. So you can, again, we can get an indication as to the scale here. You can see there that if you compared this line of contact with what existed at the beginning of June, it's barely moved. Even on the maps that are drawn by like the ultra reactionary think tanks in Washington, D.C., such as the Institute for the Study of War, even the maps that the British Ministry of Defence has relied upon, the gains of Ukraine are these like tiny, tiny indentations. And a reminder at this stage that according to sources that are on both sides of this, NATO and Russian sources, the Russians have at least 4 deeply fortified lines of defense, and the Ukrainians haven't even got close to penetrating through the first one. And now, of course, we've got the reports over the last week that the Russians are moving forces up to in and around the Kharkov region again. So at the cost of 40 to 45,000 casualties, at least 25,000 to 25,000 dead, God knows the number of horribly wounded. They've moved about as far as like an early French assault in the period of trench warfare in World War One. It's that bad. And it can't be described as anything other than a horrific, bloody failure. And this is what NATO has wrought upon Ukraine. So it's not a surprise that Zelensky's looking rather grim. Either that or his powder regime has changed, maybe both. And also that the British and the Americans are looking for scapegoats, looking for an excuse, looking for a change of narrative again. And so there seems to be now several different competing elements or factions within Washington, certainly, that are looking to either get out, get further in, or find some balance between the two. You've got the faction personified by Richard Haas and others, or either current or former members of the Council for Foreign Relations, who have been leading these unofficial talks with the Russians, looking for some way out, but of course offering nothing that the Russians would actually want. Then you've got the elements that are close to Biden and also very much representative of the view within the British government, who are desperate to do something, anything to make this thing work. And of course, then you've got the various other characters floating around who are just looking for some way to manage this so it doesn't damage them politically. The overall idea within the British ruling class, and I've written about this recently, is that they are desperate for this to work because another loss that can be attributed to them and their failed policies, which exposes them to be militarily impotent, which is what Afghanistan did. It exposed them as militarily impotent. You should have seen the hooting and the bellowing coming from the House of Commons when the final withdrawal from Afghanistan took place. There were Conservative and Labour MPs, of course, because this is a completely unified position, screaming and screaming that Britain shouldn't leave, that Britain should carry on to occupying Afghanistan, as if this was 1847 still. And that didn't end too well either, because Britain would be revealed as horribly weak if we left. Now, this, of course, brings us to a fundamental problem for British imperialism, which is that it is horribly weak. It has certain strengths left to it, of course, which are that it still has gigantic amounts of capital that go through and are contained within the City of London. They claim to still have nuclear weapons, but of course, the so-called independent British nuclear deterrent is not all that independent at all, and is largely dependent upon the technology and the provision of these weapons by the United States. So without the United States say so, this thing doesn't get fired. This is a nuclear arsenal in the British case, which is kept for prestige purposes only. Because if it comes to a nuclear war, Britain's not going to go and have a nuclear war with anybody that the US isn't already engaged with. This isn't an independent nuclear deterrent. There's nothing independent about it. It has been obtained because, first of all, there was a British nuclear program after World War II, when there was that brief period when the British imperialists still tried to assert some independent judgment and independent action from the United States. This ended in 1956 following the Suez debacle, when, of course, Eisenhower gave a nudge and a wink to Wall Street, who did a run on the pound, and that was basically it. The British imperialists then got whipped into shape and knew that they had to essentially either follow Washington around like a beaten dog, or they had to try and cajole Washington into doing their dirty work for them. Now, what they're worried about is, of course, that the image of British power, which has still been carefully maintained with, of course, the alliance with the United States, that because the United States has been declining, well, Britain has been declining along with it. Now, so this is why you've got all these like frenzied debates within the British House of Commons. It's why they get so mad when anybody suggests ducking out of this Ukraine business. It's nothing to do with helping Ukraine. I mean, this is, of course, anybody watching this stream no doubt understands that. None of this has been about helping Ukraine or 99% of Ukrainians. The only people in Ukraine who've benefited from all of this are the ones who have been rich enough to leave and seek exile elsewhere, either in Western Europe, the United States, or Israel, who've cashed out and fucked off, to use a phrase I'm rather fond of at the moment. And the British, though, are desperate for this to work, because if this goes down, they will be the ones whose fingerprints are on it. And of course, it'll be more damage to their reputation at a time when, of course, the old European colonial powers are losing ground relentlessly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, which we'll come to in a moment. So the British are desperate for this to work. There has been an Economist article that one of the most deluded journals in the world. I used to read it as an undergraduate in my early 20s, thinking that it was, wildly right-wing, but at least had accurate economic data in it. It doesn't even have that. It's a deluded fantasia these days. Maybe it always was, but I think as the position of Britain has departed ever more from the fantasies of the ruling class journals have become ever more fantastical. And so The Economist ran an article saying, well, Ukraine now needs to switch to a war of attrition, which is as good as admitting that none of the stuff that they've engaged in has worked. And this has also been followed up by a similar article on the 1945 website. There's been similar views expressed in various different American foreign policy circles. There's been admissions that the offensive hasn't worked in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So the consensus has clearly been arrived at that they at least need a new story, which of course was partly what the big conference between Zaluzny, Syrskyi and the other Ukrainian commanders that they had with Milley and Admiral Radakin of the British Ministry of Defence. Now, Radakin is now being talked about by The Economist and The Guardian, so this comes straight from the Ministry of Defence, as the guy who's going to sort it out. He's going to go in there, he's going to whip the Ukrainians into shape, and he's going to make sure that they deliver something. Of course, they can't deliver anything because all of the assumptions that were behind this offensive were wrong. They were all categorically 180 degrees from the truth, or perhaps, because I know we've got some German friends in the chat tonight, they were 360 degrees from the truth, to quote your infamous foreign minister. But the assumptions were, of course, that the amazing training that NATO had given the Ukrainian forces, which, by the way, as I've said frequently, how the hell could it be amazing training when the NATO forces that are doing the training haven't actually fought a serious war in at least 50 years. The last serious war that the United States actually fought was Vietnam, which wasn't, and Vietnam, though they beat the Americans in that war, wasn't a force the size of the old Soviet Union, though they were a very effective both field army and guerrilla army. The last time the NATO forces, the British and the French and the Americans actually fought anybody who was a comparable industrial power was 1945 and the Germans. And the Soviets did most of the heavy lifting on that anyway. And then what have they had since then? A series of colonial wars, which they've lost. The British got driven out of Yemen. By the way, they had to leave Kenya, even though they committed many horrific massacres on the way out, and still left a base there and continued to exploit the Kenyan land and population for years afterwards. But they were forced to give up a stranglehold on a place that they didn't want to leave. The French, of course, lost in, as I said, in Vietnam. They lost in Algeria. The Americans lose in Korea. The Americans lose in Vietnam. And they haven't. And what have they done recently? What was the great American revival militarily in the 1980s? It was what? Invading tiny Grenada, destroying the revolution there, which we will do a future episode on, which was, of course, personified in the Clint Eastwood 1980s America Comes Back classic, Heartbreak Ridge. Do watch it if you get a chance. It's one of Eastwood's most reactionary films. So this reputation, this big reputation that the NATO countries have for military efficiency, what's it based on? Exactly. The fact that they've got like expensive equipment, the fact that they claim to be the victors of 1945, even though they were on the winning side, but they didn't do most of the fighting, that they claimed to be the victors of the Cold War. Well, they didn't win the Cold War. The Soviet Union imploded under the weight of a counter-revolution. So none of this, all of the assumptions behind this Ukrainian offensive, that they were being trained by the best, they aren't. That the equipment is the best in the world, it clearly isn't. That the Russian forces were demoralized and ill-equipped, they're not. I mean, Baerbock repeated the claim the other day that the Russians are using microchips out of washing machines again. I mean, it's like, if I didn't know better, I'd swear that this woman was smoking something extremely strong. I hope she is, because at least that will provide a better explanation. But everything that they built the assumptions on with regard to this offensive, has been incorrect. The Russians weren't going to run away, and anybody could have told you that just from a cursory glance through like Russian telegram channels, Russian media, opinion poll surveys inside the Russian Federation itself, the performance of the Russian armed forces, though of course that they haven't got everything right by quite a long way, but mainly because the political assumptions underlying the initial phases of the special military operation was wrong. But the Russian armed forces have never just quit and run away across the entirety of this special military operation. That's just not happened. And it's based, again, the idea that they would run away was partially based on like an assumption that this was still the Russian army from 1994 in Grozny, which, by the way, didn't, I think, run away then either. They lost a battle in the city, but they didn't quit. There was a lot of corruption in that army. There was a lot of bad mistakes due to the fact that the Russian state was collapsing at the time. But again, like, they had the idea that the Russians ran away from Kiev. No. What President Putin says about that is correct. They withdrew from Kiev in order to make a concession to try and seal a deal that the Americans and the British blocked. So again, assumptions based on complete bullshit sold to the Ukrainians via this completely vile collection of compradors that runs Kiev on behalf of US and British imperialism. And so I would come back to the point again. Every single assumption that they made, that they based this assault on, that they have sacrificed at least 20,000 people who have, we know are been confirmed dead or very likely to be dead, 45,000 killed and wounded in total, or 40 to 45,000. The estimates do vary. So what was this all based on? It was based on complete glue-huffing nonsense. You'd have to be completely off your tree to believe that any of this was going to work. And they did it anyway. And so you have to come back to the question of why. Now, there is the big why, which is, of course, that US imperialism has been in a crisis now for many, many years, since at least 2008, I would argue before then, and has been desperately flailing around trying to complete its mission to assert control over the Middle East, and that failed. That ran aground in Syria, partially thanks to Russian intervention. They redoubled their efforts, of course, in building up Ukraine. And then what happened there? They got the war that they were looking for with their outsourced military, and they wildly pursued this because, of course, again, as we've covered many times before, the ultimate goal of this is to secure a collapse of the Russian Federation itself. As that mad Austrian idiot, Gunther Fehlinger, keeps publishing like Reddit maps of broken up countries, well, you know, he's easy to dismiss as like some Austrian crank, some ex-financier who's basically living out his sort of militaristic Reddit fantasies on some beach in the Balkans somewhere. But he's clearly speaking for some of the planners inside the State Department and inside NATO as to what they would like to happen. What they would like to happen is what happened to Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. I mean, it's probably one of the reasons why Herr Fehlinger is basing himself in the Balkans. It's the absolute model of what they would want to happen to Russia, to China, and as we've seen from Herr Fehlinger's maps, to Brazil and Ethiopia and India and everywhere else as well. I mean, bear in mind the shattering of countries and the carving out of different entities from them. This, of course, is something which is an old game, but in the modern era, it's something that British imperialism has excelled at, with the absolute triumph being their first withdrawal from, of course, British India, the fracturing of that landmass into India, West Pakistan, East Pakistan, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Burma, now Myanmar, and the breaking up of all of this is, of course, one of the crowning achievements of British imperialism. You withdraw from a place, but you set it up basically to make sure that the nations that emerge there keep on fighting each other for many, many decades to come. And so the economic potential of these countries is stunted through constant warfare. And of course, it allows you to try and finagle your way back in somehow. In the end, the British didn't get back in to India, but the Americans certainly managed to exercise a gigantic hold, a stranglehold over Pakistan. And that lasts to this day, with, of course, their intervention directly leading to the deposing of Imran Khan. Now, whether that, of course, stops Pakistan's general alignment towards BRICS in the future is another question entirely, and whether the interests of the Pakistani ruling class will ultimately take them in the direction of a more and more solidified alliance with the Chinese, again, that's another question for another day. The point about all of this is that the overall plan was this crazed idea, motivated by the desperation of US imperialism, to break up the Russian Federation in the manner that they broke up and destroyed Yugoslavia. Incidentally, if you've not found the footage from the Milosevic trial yet, I did post some of this in the Telegram group. It's the footage from when Slobodan Milosevic conducted his own defense in a trial 20 years ago, before, of course, he was most likely assassinated in his prison cell by somebody or another. Probably the US, could be the British, could be any number of people, because his defense was proving too good. So go and check that out. You can find it on the Telegram group. You can also find it on the Internet Archive site. But I come back to the point. This was the plan. And the plan is motivated, of course, by the crisis of US imperialism. And of course, what is it that US imperialism wants to do but cannot do? They would love to be able to assault Russia directly, but they can't because of the nuclear weapon question. Some of them would love to try, some of the imperial planners in the US would love to try and mobilize via the institution of a draft in the United States, but they can't. Just like they couldn't when it came to the Iraq War, even though some of the crazier end of the Democrats, I believe, wanted to actually do this. The US imperialists can't call for a draft because, of course, the long shadow of the defeat in Vietnam hangs over them. The British imperialists couldn't do it either. There's no way this ruling class can call upon the loyalty of this population unless, of course, the nation was shown to be directly under attack. And even with the legacy of 9/11, the US imperialists couldn't drum up enough enthusiasm to join the army of occupation in Iraq. Military recruitment trailed right off. If you want to call it a social contract between the working class, or at least the upper end of the working class and the ruling class, has been fraying for many, many years. These aren't ruling classes that can call upon the masses. Again, Mao Zedong was right in the 1950s when he said the reason why they're paper tigers is because their connection with the masses is very, very weak. And therefore, this leads us back to the question of the Ukrainian offensive. This is why Ukraine was subjected to the coup in 2014, why it has been flooded with Western trained and controlled fascists since 1991, why it has been turned into an outsourced military for these weakened paper tiger fading imperialist nations, why hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are dying, why many more will probably die before the end. Why has all this been done? To keep US imperialism and its pathetic hanger-on, British imperialism, able to extract profit from wherever they send their capital all over the world. It has all been done to make sure that the parasite class at the top of US imperialism, the less than 1% of the population who benefit the most from all of this, and their equivalent in Britain and France and Germany and Italy and Spain, and to a lesser extent Portugal, all get to carry on clipping their coupons and to continue feasting. That's what this is all about. So whenever you see some scumbag in some newspaper article arguing that, well, you know, it's about helping Ukraine, about defending democracy, sovereignty, all the usual garbage that these people come out with, bear in mind that none of that is, of course, true. That is the papering over that is going on here. That is the attempted whitewash of this foul and diseased system, which is just as they did in 1914, but now in an even more cowardly fashion, fighting basically like a more high-tech World War I style campaign, feeding hundreds of thousands of men and a whole nation into a horrific maelstrom of death in order to keep the parasites able to keep their share prices high. This is what it's all about. And don't ever lose sight of that. Don't ever lose sight of the fact that this is essentially about keeping a tiny number of the populations in the Western European countries and Canada and the United States in the style to which they have become accustomed. And of course, you get a certain layer of the population in Britain and the United States and other places, maybe around about 10 to 15% of the population who are there hangers on. So never forget this. Maybe it is easy to forget it sometimes when you're immersed in just following the details and the numbers and the statistics and who's taken what village and what tiny scrap of land has exchanged hands. But, you know, as Lenin himself said, war is awful, awfully good for profits. And this is what it's all about. What it is all about is keeping the ability of US imperialism to keep moving its capital around anywhere in the world, to keep exploiting any source of labor in the world, to keep exploiting any source of natural resources anywhere in the world, and to maintain its military credibility by making sure that it takes out its rivals. And beyond that, trying to bring down its rivals and destroy them so that their countries can be asset stripped like a plague of locusts has been visited upon them. And this is why, as Marxists, we say the system has no future, because the only thing it has left to offer now, the only way that its system can be revitalized is by a gigantic, etc., etc. This is the reality of these people. This is the system that they serve. And we should never forget that. As US military has been punched up gendarmerie and irregular death squads in Iraq and Afghanistan, not at all surprised the jarheads and grunts blame the Ukrainians for becoming bullet sponges at our urging. Yep, and it really is that disgusting. Well, thank you, Paul. I try to have a sense of humour about things, but sometimes it's rather difficult. Irish Partisan says, the NATO armies are paper tigers. They got lucky when they hoodwinked and double-crossed Milosevic to withdraw from Kosovo. Had the Yugoslav People's Army chose to fight, they would have defeated NATO. Yes, I think Irish Partisan is right. Remember, as we've said before, the confrontation over Kosovo ended basically because of two things. Mainly, it was Yeltsin selling out Milosevic and saying that we will not supply you with food and or energy over the winter. And also there was a deal that was presented to Milosevic that included the idea that the fate of Kosovo was essentially up for negotiation, that it would not become independent, that it would still nominally be part of Serbia. And remember that the NATO armies, they didn't want to go in. They didn't want to go and fight the Yugoslav People's Army inside Kosovo. They were trying to get the Hungarians to do it for them. Even Douglas MacGregor, who was in charge of the NATO military campaign to some extent at the time, commented upon that in an interview I believe he did with Judge Napolitano on his channel, that they were trying to get the Hungarians to go and fight the Serbs. And the Hungarians said no. They didn't want to have the NATO armies actually have to go and fight on the ground in Kosovo, because they could probably have blown Yugoslavia, or what was left of it, to pieces. But whether they could have defeated the Yugoslavs on the ground, I don't think they would have done. I think they'd have lost on the ground, and it would have been a huge embarrassment to Clinton and Blair and could have marked the end of Blair's premiership. Unfortunately, Milosevic not only got sold out, but again, in a mark of weakness with regard to him and the political structure he sat atop of, he chose to believe and the deal that was presented to him. Of course, they didn't stop working to overthrow him. And I think he understood, judging from the last statements he made towards the end of his life, I think he started to understand the errors that he'd made that led to the failure there. But yeah, NATO couldn't have won that war, I don't think. And little wonder that Putin refers to the Western imperialism as the empire of lies. It's a good phrase because lies is all they've got left. The bullshit is all that remains. Bullshit money, bullshit industries, bullshit imperialism. And the real remaining powers that British imperialism has, of course, there is the real power there of the amount of capital they've got to move around, but their ability to actually affect via propaganda, that's, of course, based on a completely false image of what Britain is all about. It's a completely false image that they sell around the world. Of course, they're not the only ones to do that, but the distance between the image of Britain that they sell and the reality of life here has never been as big as it is now. Right. Glad you came up the stream, Snakes. Ash says, at first I thought the ruling class were outright lying, but it's clear they were high on their own supply of misconceptions about Russia, and now they are high in the copium den of obvious losses. Yeah, I mean, I thought that they were... I thought that there are people in the system that know the truth, but of course you can't express that truth now openly. Certainly you can't express it in Britain at cabinet level or really in any of the major media outlets, either broadcast or print media. And you can't express it because it reveals a fundamental problem for the British ruling class, which they have no idea how to solve, which is, well, how on earth are they going to preserve their profit margins and their position in the world when US imperialism starts to shatter, and when its reputation takes further hits, and when more and more people start essentially just opting out of the US dominated system? How are they going to deal with that? A question which we must return to. Irish Partisan says, I foresee major geopolitical shift in Balkans on foot of the inevitable NATO defeat in Ukraine. The pendulum is swinging back in Serbia's favour, and I haven't even started on West Africa and Niger. Yep. Yeah. Okay. People still having problems with the stream. Okay. Right. So, okay. So everything seems to have balanced itself out now. So what I'll do is I'll just move on to a couple of other questions, a couple of other issues to talk about tonight. And of course, I wanted to mention the situation in Niger, which is the ongoing crisis that has been prompted by the fact that the Nigerian military, led by Abdurrahman Chiani, overthrew the French stooge president, Mohamed Bazoum, and imprisoned him. And this has been, of course, met by vast popular enthusiasm across Niger and promises of political and military support from at least Mali and Burkina Faso. And this, of course, has caused an extended crisis inside the imperialist-dominated organization ECOWAS. The African Union has become divided upon it and has refused to back military action. ECOWAS, following divisions inside Nigeria, the major military component of this alliance, has now declared that they have a force of 12,000 men ready to invade Niger itself. The question is, do they actually have it? Is this something which they can actually bring to bear? And is this something which could actually secure the invasion of the country? Now, bear in mind, Niger is a place with a lot of empty space in it, and the capital is relatively close to the border it shares with Nigeria and other countries that are in ECOWAS. Now, the promises of support from Mali and Burkina Faso have remained strong. So the question is, well, they say they've got 12,000 men. Is that enough, or is this merely meant to be another threat, another attempt at intimidation? Is it the case that the ECOWAS countries, including Nigeria, which of course is controlled by a man in Bola Tinubu, who we've covered previously, is a pure US puppet, in that he is a man who is of a deeply compromised background, who has had a documented past as a man who laundered money for drug dealers in Chicago when he was living and working over there in the 80s and early 90s. So this is a man who is very much somebody who I would say is a favorite of certain intelligence agencies, given that's exactly the sort of compromised figure they like to work with. So the question is, well, do the ECOWAS nations go ahead with this? And my guess is still probably not, even though when they start rattling the saber, there's every chance that things could escape and go out of control. The masses in Niger are plainly still with the military government. Not only have they mobilized to volunteer to form a civilian militia to defend their country, but they're also staging mass demonstrations outside of the French military base there, where 1,500 French troops are, threatening to storm it unless the French withdraw. They've also ordered the French ambassador out of the country, but he's refused to leave. And in a typical colonial fashion, Macron says he refused to acknowledge any orders that come from the Nigerian government headed by Chiani. Of course, he's saying, oh, well, I can't possibly obey this government because it's come to power through a coup. Of course, we've got to remember that the French have a long history of imposing rulers upon West African nations, and they never had a problem with that. Of course, it's the sort of thing you come to expect from the imperialists. But plainly, I think a couple of things are playing into the fact that the ECOWAS intervention is still doubtful. Firstly, it's the divisions and the instability within the ECOWAS countries. Nigeria, of course, is very unstable. It has a large army, but it's mainly used for internal repression. There has been significant anti-government demonstrations in places like Senegal. There is an open question as to, well, do Mali and Burkina Faso intervene if this invasion goes ahead? Is anybody in ECOWAS really wanting to do that? And of course, then you get the question of, well, how much pressure is being brought to bear on them by the US and the French imperialists, and the British imperialists probably as well, who must be getting a bit nervous about their status in Kenya and other places. So again, it's still a bit of an open question as to whether this goes ahead. I would say that the big factor in their hesitation has been the response of the masses in Niger, who are going out waving Russian flags, waving DPRK flags. And it's always obvious that the masses in many countries know instinctively who's been giving the middle finger to the empire and doing it successfully for many years. So the fact that there's been so much enthusiasm behind the anti-imperialist actions that the junta has taken so far has plainly made the imperialist stooges in ECOWAS nervous. So this is a situation which could escape out of control very quickly. Maybe the French and the US imperialists will tell ECOWAS that they have to invade, they have to do it. Otherwise, I don't know, maybe Bola Tinubu's criminal past gets revealed. Maybe they've got something else hanging over his head. But if they compel these unstable and divided countries into a military campaign, which they are by no means guaranteed to win, if other countries come to the aid of Niger, if the population is armed and ready to fight, if the masses are solidly against the intervention of other countries, well, even if they were to win a military campaign, if they're faced with mass resistance from the population, well, what does that mean? That generally means that the invading force starts to engage in massacres, as the imperialists have done throughout their history, as their stooges would do as well, which of course creates an even bigger mess. You may manage to repress a movement for a few months, a few years, but it would do ultimately is it would destabilize ECOWAS and the countries within it even further. And you would see more revolts in Nigeria, in Senegal, in the Ivory Coast and elsewhere against French colonialism. It would actually worsen the position of the imperialists in many respects if these cowards are shown to be trying to hurl the African nations against each other to preserve what? To preserve what? The profits of French imperialism and its uranium extraction businesses and its gold mining in Niger. Again, like, this is something that the African masses will watch this in the West African countries and beyond that, and they will watch it and they will draw the appropriate conclusions from it. Because again, the masses will learn an awful lot even before the emergence of a proper revolutionary party, because they know very well who has been stiffing them for many, many years and who has been sabotaging their country at every turn. And if Tinubu and the others try and lead a pro-imperial, pro-French intervention force into Niger, no matter what bullshit they try and dress it up with, people in their own countries are going to know it. And it's going to only make things worse for the puppet regimes that the French still have in West Africa. So let's keep an eye on this, because this is a vitally important situation. And should imperialism lose here, should the junta headed by Chiani prevail and their rule be solidified, then that's going to be a huge blow to French imperialism. It will only destabilize the situation in France even further. It will drive division within the French ruling class about what they should be doing. And everybody who regards themselves as a communist or anti-imperialist of any description should be hoping that the Nigerians prevail in this struggle, because it can only be to the advantage of revolutionaries all over the world if the French and ultimately the US imperialists are defeated in Niger. So we'll come back to the question of West Africa when things develop further. I wanted just to drop in as well a mention of the Argentine elections, because the Argentinian BRICS candidacy is being called into question already. So I thought I'd give a brief explanation as to what's going on with regard to the Argentine general election, because of course you've got a massive election to be held on the 22nd of October, and as is the custom in Argentina, you get the president and vice president elected, and the members of the National Congress and the governors of most of the Argentine provinces all elected on the same day. So clearly, this is going to be very, very important with regard to the BRICS candidacy of Argentina. So you have, of course, three major contenders, which is Sergio Massa, who is broadly speaking, the left Peronist candidate. He heads an alliance of parties called Unión por la Patriótica, and then you get the sort of center-right, I think would be the right correct description here. Candidate Patricia Bullrich, who is the head of an organization or another coalition, which is the Juntos por el Cambio, and that's a broadly center-right coalition. Then you get this guy Javier Milei, who proclaims himself to be a libertarian. In actual fact, you dig anything below the surface with this guy, he's in like an ultra reactionary. Like he uses libertarian rhetoric from time to time, but this guy's like an a sort of Bolsonaro or almost Pinochet type figure, given what he believes in. One of the things that he said in the past is that he basically wants to undo all of Argentinian history throughout the 20th century. He says we need to go back to the kind of country we were in 1900. Now, I've mentioned this before, that one of like the reactionary fantasies of like US and British imperialism is that Argentina was like one of the great places in the world, and that it mysteriously collapsed after 1900. Now, I haven't got the time tonight to go fully into what happened at the end of the 19th century, but basically Argentina, along with like quite a number of other South American countries, was basically run by like landed gentry figures for quite a lot of the 19th century after their successful revolutions against the Spanish. But the one thing that defined a lot of them was, of course, that they were still dominated in the 19th century by, well, in Argentina's case, it was British imperialism. British imperialism was making a lot of money in Argentina up to the early 20th century. What happens in the early part of the 20th century then becomes a country which is, of course, gets more industrialized. You get the emergence of trade unionism, socialist parties, you get quite a lot of anarchist organizations, and ultimately you get a communist party emerges after the Bolshevik Revolution, and ultimately you get, through all of this, emerges the figure of Perón. And it is the figure of Perón, Juan Perón, who still dominates Argentine politics to this day. Because if you look at the coalitions running in this election, all of them contain elements which trace their origins back to Peronism. So, for instance, like there are Peronists on Milei's side, avowed Peronists, there are Peronists in the Bullrich coalition, and there's the left Peronists in the Sergio Massa-headed coalition. Now, the Peronists who are on the right, on the side of Argentina, the more reactionary ones, trace their line of descent from, of course, the presidencies that followed the end of the military regime there in the 1980s, and you get the various different Peronist figures, such as Carlos Menem, who was a much more typically sort of 1990s figure. He was the guy who, as I've said before, borrowed tons of money, got like a degree of false prosperity for a little while. Then Argentina plunged into a gigantic amount of debt, which he played a huge role in landing it in. And so these figures, they descended from Menem, politically descended from Menem, are involved with the right-wing coalition and the ultra-reactionary coalition. Now, Milei overperformed, contrary to expectations, in the primary round, which has just been held a couple of weeks ago in Argentina. And he did so principally by taking votes away from the center-right coalition. The voting base, the voting for Union Patriotica, largely has remained consistent. Before the polls, ultimately in the primary round, they all came into within about 3% of each other. So you have basically like a 33, almost split to some degree in the polls. Some polls put Milei further ahead. Bear in mind, whenever you're looking at like polling, especially at a time when it's clear that there's at least one section of the Argentine ruling class that's pushing Milei very, very hard, with the idea that if they bring in like an ultra-reactionary figure to lead some kind of like Pinochetist regime, and he's very much cut from similar cloth, I would argue, to like Bolsonaro, given that Bolsonaro was more aligned typically with the military. Milei is an economist. But one of the things that Bolsonaro liked to do was he liked to flirt with the legacies of the old Brazilian military regime that ran the country from the 60s to the 80s. Milei's been flirting with similar things. He's aligned with people who think that Operation Condor was a pretty good thing. He's denied at various points that there was the mass slaughter of leftists and communists and left Peronists and trade unionists that went on in the dirty war in Argentina, even though it's been very well established even by the bourgeois courts in Argentina now that dirty war did happen and thousands were killed, all, by the way, under the supervision of the CIA. And so Milei's been flirting with the idea of denying that at various points. He sort of flirts with the idea that this was a good thing. And clearly, like, this is Argentine Bolsonaro. This is like the most extremely reactionary wing of the ruling class, faced with an impasse in Argentina, which is that for all the progressive progress that was made to a degree under the Kirchners, it's again reached the point where Argentina has been further mired in debt by the previous right-wing administration. It's undergoing an inflation crisis. Clearly, a section of the ruling class has decided that an ultra-reactionary turn is now needed. So you get this pseudo-libertarian, in reality, more pseudo-fascist figure like Milei running around saying, well, we won't join BRICS because we don't deal with communists. Brazil's communist, he says. China's communist. And of course, because he's been taking votes away from the Bullrich-led coalition, she's then been tacking to the right even further and agreeing with Milei. So it's only like Union Patriotica, the left coalition, the broad left Peronist coalition, which, by the way, has the three biggest communist parties in Argentina are all part of the Peronist coalition. I really am going to have to do a dive into Peronism at some stage and all its manifestations. But this is the situation. Like any of them at this stage could come out on top in the election to be held in October. We've still got broadly speaking, just under 2 months towards till we get to Argentine polling day. But if Milei wins, one of his first acts will probably be to dump the BRICS application, because unlike Bolsonaro, he won't be lumbered with the problem of already being in it. I think that one of the things that the US imperialists wanted Bolsonaro to do was to either disrupt BRICS to the point where it became inoperable, or some of them probably wanted him to lead Brazil out of BRICS entirely. Now, he couldn't do that because it turned out that due to the close relations trade-wise between Brazil and China in particular, that a large section of the Brazilian ruling class didn't want that. Now, Argentina's not in it yet. It's just an invitation to join. So if Milei does win, or Bullrich does win, we can pretty much take it as read that this application gets burnt straight away. Certainly if Milei wins. Bullrich maybe is a little bit more open to negotiation, but given that she's tacked further to the right to keep up with Milei, I would say it's likely to be dumped. So that raises the question of, well, what the hell do they do? What do BRICS do then if Milei or Bullrich decides to jettison this? Well, the likelihood is that either Bolivia or Venezuela then get invited, because the Brazilians will want somebody in. It's more likely to be Bolivia, because I think that would be more acceptable to the coalition that Lula heads. I think there's some characters in there that get extremely nervous about any closer relationship with Venezuela, given that, I mean, you start researching South American coalition politics, my God, it makes some of the stuff that goes on in Europe look really straightforward. But basically, people like AMLO in Mexico and Lula in Brazil and the Argentine politicians have coalitions which list like 50-odd parties sometimes. So basically what's going to happen is, like, I would say the Argentine application to BRICS is shaky at best. If either of the more reactionary candidates win, it's likely to be binned, in which case then it's probably going to be Bolivia, or I would guess, that then receives the invitation at the behest of the Brazilians. Now, whether whether Milei or Bullrich win is open to debate. Clearly, a section of the ruling class is desperate to use Milei basically as a sledgehammer against the organized working class in Argentina, which even after all the reactionary attacks that have taken place from the former Macri administration, and of course the fact that the country's basically been reduced to debt slavery by US imperialism, even now the Argentine working class retains a strong fighting force and retains the ability to actually get in the way of the ruling class's plans. Clearly, Milei is designed to be the sledgehammer against that, and who knows what line he may pursue there. One of the things that made me laugh about all of these statements with regard to, oh, we will go back to the nation we were in 1900. I mean, this is like the pure bullshit that the ultra-reactionaries engage in. I mean, all bourgeois politicians engage in bullshit, as we've been talking about. But the reactionary garbage of like an ultra-right winger, especially in a nation that's been subjected to colonialism, subjected to like neo-colonialism and like attempts at re-establishing various forms of imperial control like Argentina has, and has been subjected like to brutish military rule and mass slaughter, is like, this guy's big idea is to take Argentina back to the point where it was completely dominated by British imperialism. Only now the role of British imperialism will be played by what? A fading US empire. That's the big idea. And this is why you get, when you get these right-wing characters, like these ultra-reactionary types like Milei, or any of the like the European reactionaries these days, or like a Bolsonaro figure, basically they have to engage in all this like phony machismo, the fake tough guy act, the blood-curdling threats, which are of course designed to intimidate the working class. But the reason why they have to engage in all these melodramatics is their basic message is, we will reduce our country, be it Brazil or Argentina, back to the status of being a neo-colony. That's their plan. That's their big agenda. all masked with this sort of fake macho garbage. And it's like with any kind of European fascist back in the day, any ultra-reactionary, they have to engage in all the drama, all the melodramatics, all the act, so to speak, all the acting that they do, because it's to cover up the fact that basically what they're going to do is make sure that the country is reduced to, for 90% of the population, to the status of either like comfortably off indentured servants, or in the case of the working class, hyper exploited wage slaves who are denied even the most basic democratic representation. And that's their big idea for the renewal of the nation: reduce it to the status of basically a beaten down slave state, which is what fascism promised, or well, it's what fascism delivered to Germans and Italians, and Spaniards and Portuguese, or what the Greek colonels wanted to deliver in the 60s, and what Milei wants to deliver Argentina to now. Beyond all the melodramatics basically lies an agenda which is to make the country into a doormat for imperialism. And that should be thrown in the face of these clowns every chance that anybody gets.